For over 1,000 years, the period following the fall of the Roman Empire has been branded with a haunting name: the Dark Ages. We are taught that it was a post-apocalyptic world, a time when human civilization stepped backward into a shadow of disease, ignorance, and endless bloodshed. But what if the history books you studied missed the big picture? What if these 1,000 years of chaos were not a tragedy, but actually a brutal forge? A harsh environment that secretly smashed the old order to build the foundations of the modern world. In this video, we will compress 1,000 years of European history into a single story. You will witness how the collapse of a massive empire forced an entire continent into survival mode. And then the unthinkable happened. A ruthless phantom that wiped out a third of Europe's population unexpectedly became the very key that unlocked the freedoms you enjoy today. But to understand how the modern world was born, we must first witness how the ancient world died. Let's rewind to the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Back then, the Roman Empire was not just a country, it was the entire known world. Surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, Rome established an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Its citizens enjoyed running water, massive trade networks, and a powerful centralized government. To a Roman, their empire was eternal. However, beneath that golden shell, the foundation was rotting. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the empire had grown too large to be managed from a single city. Political corruption spread like a disease. The economy relied heavily on slave labor. When the conquests stopped, the flow of wealth dried up. To cover massive military costs, Rome continuously devalued its currency. This led to crippling inflation, wiping out people's savings. As a result, famine and deadly plagues began to decimate the population. But that wasn't even the worst part. Defending borders that stretched for thousands of miles became a logistical nightmare. In 395, in a desperate attempt to survive, the empire was split in 2. A wealthy eastern half ruled from Constantinople, and a decaying western half with Rome as its capital. This division changed everything. While the East continued to thrive, the West plunged into poverty and became extremely vulnerable. Right outside their borders, in the dark forests of northern Europe, warlords and nomadic tribes were hungry for new land. Pushed westward by other fierce enemies, they constantly pressed against the river borders. The Roman army, once an invincible force, was now thin and fragmented. Eventually, the borders collapsed. The barbarian tribes didn't just invade, they migrated en masse, bringing hundreds of thousands of people straight into Roman territory. Yet the absolute end came in a way no one expected. In 476, a barbarian leader marched into Italy and quietly deposed the last Western Roman emperor. He was just a boy with no real power. There was no fiery battle or epic resistance that day. The empire didn't explode. It simply faded away and took its last breath. Over time, the aftermath was continent-wide destruction. Without a central government, the entire system of the Western world collapsed. The great aqueducts stopped flowing. Paved roads were swallowed by forests. Coins vanished. The professional army dissolved. Europe was no longer a unified giant. Instead, it fractured into dozens of small, poor, and weak kingdoms. The light of the ancient civilization officially went out. But as darkness fell, a brutal and entirely new mechanism of survival began to rise from the ruins. Part 3. Escalating conflict. The iron grip of feudalism. By the 9th century, the crumbling ruins of the Roman world faced a terrifying new nightmare. The great empires of the past were gone. In their place, a fractured, bleeding continent was completely exposed, and the predators of the Dark Ages knew exactly when to strike. From the freezing waters of the north, the Vikings unleashed a wave of absolute terror. Using shallow draft longships, they didn't just attack the coastlines, They sailed deep into the heart of Europe through its rivers, plundering defenseless settlements with brutal efficiency. But the threat wasn't just from the north. From the east, fiercely skilled Magyar horsemen swept across the land. And from the south, Islamic pirates and raiders dominated the Mediterranean shores. Europe was entirely surrounded. It was a continent under siege. This led to a desperate life-or-death question for the common people. If the distant kings were too weak to protect you, who would? The answer to that question birthed one of the most ruthless systems in human history. Without a central government or a professional army, power shifted dramatically. Local elites and warlords took matters into their own hands. To defend their territories, they began constructing a dense network of fortresses, first made of wood and later of massive, impenetrable stone. However, building castles and maintaining full-time armored cavalry required an immense amount of wealth. As a result, a devastating trade was forced upon the surviving population. Weak and terrified peasants surrendered their land, their freedom, and their endless labor to these local warlords. In exchange, they were granted the right to hide behind the castle walls when the raiders came. This was the dawn of feudalism. It wasn't a system of justice, it was an extortion racket built on iron and blood. The lords ruled by coercive force. The peasants, now reduced to serfs, were permanently bound to the land. Society became a strict hierarchy of personal relationships and mutual obligations, locked in a dark, localized struggle. For hundreds of years, it seemed as if Europe would be trapped in this suffocating system forever. Kings were overshadowed by their own vassals. Progress came to a grinding halt. Yet, just when the darkness seemed absolute, the earth itself intervened. Part 4. The Turning Point. The Awakening and the Phantom. Around the year 1000, the global climate suddenly began to change. The earth warmed. And this seemingly small environmental shift triggered a massive chain reaction. Warmer weather meant longer and more reliable growing seasons. Combined with new, heavy-duty agricultural technologies like the iron plow, food production skyrocketed. The effect was explosive. For the first time in centuries, Europeans produced more food than they could eat. This led to a dramatic population boom. The dense, terrifying forests of Europe were cleared, making way for endless fields of cultivation. As a result, the defensive, survivalist mindset of the Dark Ages began to shatter. Europe was no longer just hiding behind stone walls. It was expanding. Small villages rapidly grew into bustling towns. Old Roman cities that had been abandoned for centuries roared back to life. A massive urbanization process swept across the continent, fueled by a spectacular commercial revival. Merchants formed self-governing cities, completely independent from the feudal lords. They re-established long-distance trade routes, connecting the continent in ways not seen since the Pax Romana. Wealth poured in, and with wealth came a thirst for knowledge. The very first universities were founded. A vibrant cultural renaissance began to flourish. Eventually, Europeans were not just conquering their internal frontiers, they were looking outward. Armed with new wealth and a militant religious fervor, Christian knights marched eastward. In 1095, the Pope called for the liberation of the Holy Land. Tens of thousands of warriors swarmed across the Mediterranean in the massive military campaigns known as the Crusades. The weak, fragmented West had awakened as a formidable, expansive civilization. They had beaten the Dark Ages. They had won. But right at the absolute peak of this glorious triumph, right when the cities were overflowing with wealth and the trade routes were bustling with merchants, an untold fact was about to alter human history. A silent, invisible phantom had already boarded the merchant ships in the east. A biological nightmare was creeping along those newly opened trade routes, heading straight for the heart of Europe. An unstoppable force that was about to slaughter 1 out of every 3 people. and violently tear the medieval world apart. Part 5. The Revelation. The Black Death and the Fall of Feudalism. In the year 1347, a fleet of merchant ships docked in the Mediterranean. But the cargo they brought was not silk or spices, it was death. A global plague, now known as the Black Death, had reached the shores of Europe. It spread across the continent with terrifying speed. It was an unprecedented demographic disaster. Entire settlements were wiped off the map. Cities turned into mass graveyards. Within a few short, agonizing years, approximately 1/3 of the entire European population was simply gone. It seemed as if the end of the world had finally arrived. But here is the hidden truth that history often overlooks. For the survivors, the consequences of this apocalyptic plague were not entirely grim. In fact, this devastating tragedy became the exact mechanism needed to shatter the oppressive system of the Dark Ages. The logic was brutal, but simple. With so many people dead, the fundamental economics of Europe flipped overnight. Land, which was once fiercely guarded by the lords, suddenly became widely available. But more importantly, human labor became incredibly scarce. This led to a massive shift in power. For centuries, peasants were treated as disposable property. But now, the lords desperately needed workers to harvest their fields. Suddenly, the bargaining power was in the hands of the surviving peasants. They realized their worth. They demanded higher wages, improved living conditions, and the ultimate prize, their freedom. When the panicked elites tried to refuse, furious revolts erupted across Europe. Most were brutally suppressed. However, in the long run, the change was absolutely inevitable. Lords were forced to pay wages. Serfs bought their freedom and moved to the growing cities. The iron grip of the nobility was broken. As a result, the suffocating system of feudalism collapsed. Out of the darkness of the Great Plague, a new era of liberty and explosive creativity began to emerge. Part 6. Resolution and Legacy. Forging the Modern World. The world was changing fast, and the military superiority of the medieval lords was about to be blown to pieces. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, a terrifying new invention arrived on the battlefields of Europe: gunpowder. This changed everything. The bravest, most heavily armored knight could now be shot down by a simple, untrained infantryman from a distance. And those massive, impenetrable stone castles, they could be effortlessly breached by the devastating power of cannons. Supporting these new armies of infantry and artillery was an incredibly costly affair. It was an expense that only kings could manage. As they monopolized the use of force, kings quickly consolidated their power. They forced the once mighty aristocrats to serve as mere administrators. This led to the birth of the sovereign state. The chaotic mosaic of feudal lands slowly transformed into the powerful, centralized nations of England, France, and Spain. Simultaneously, recovering cities became hubs of explosive innovation. The printing press was invented, breaking the church's monopoly on knowledge. In Italy, scholars initiated a brilliant renaissance, reviving the lost glory of ancient Rome and Greece. By the year 1500, Europe had not only recovered from its darkest crisis, it had rebuilt itself on a foundation of steel, science, and exploration. They cast their gaze outward, crossing the vast Atlantic Ocean, and the modern era officially began. So, the next time you hear the term the Dark Ages, remember this: history is never just a list of random, boring events. It is a relentless chain of cause and effect. The political borders we know today, the freedom of your labor, and the technological drive of modern society did not appear out of thin air. They were forged in the fires of a collapsed empire. The 1,000 years of medieval chaos were not a step backward. They were a necessary, brutal incubation period. A fierce struggle for survival that ultimately built the world you live in today. If you want to uncover more hidden truths about the rise and fall of the greatest empires in history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We will see you in the next chapter.